Good morning, everybody. Unless, of course, you're watching this video in Australia, then good evening. Because today we're talking about the first fleet to Australia. That's why I'm wearing this hat. We've got a kangaroo. We've got a koala. The hat doesn't really go over the tie, but never mind. So basically, who discovered Australia first? We're not going to talk very long about this. We're going to move swiftly on to the first fleet. But we need to talk about who discovered it. Now, suffice to say, the most important person in who discovered Australia is James Cook, because that was the most important voyage. But he didn't discover Australia. He was the first person to go to the east coast of Australia, but he was not the first person there. The first person to go to Australia on exploration voyage was probably the Chinese, followed by the Dutch, then the Portuguese. But the Dutch were the first official people there. So suffice to say, Captain Cook was not the first person there. Also wasn't the ancient Egyptians. If you just heard me say ancient Egyptians and gone, what? Then look up the Gosford Glyphs, but they did not discover Australia. Whatever you read on the internet is false about that. Anyway, so we were originally, as a country, it was quite customary for, if people committed a crime, in England this is, people committed a crime, we just shipped them off to America. Now, America gained their independence in the 1700s, late 1700s, so we couldn't send them to America anymore because, oh no, they didn't want them anymore because they were independent. What are we going to do? Well, we just found this new place called Australia, or Terra Australa, or New Holland it was called back then. Nobody called it Australia back then, but we're going to call it Australia now for ease sake. Anyway, so they said yes, to send them to New Holland, Australia. So they did, and they put a man in charge, a chap called Arthur Phillip, in 1788. A chap called Arthur Phillip took 11 ships, I'm quite sure it's 11 ships, and 1,030 convicts to Australia. Some of them were sentenced to life in Australia, most of them though were like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years sentenced in Australia. So after that time they were allowed to go home. Although we'll find out how many of them didn't go home later. So what happened is they got there and they said, now set up a colony at Botany Bay. Now they got to Botany Bay and said this place was rubbish. So they went round the corner and found a place called Port Jackson. They called it Port Jackson, and they said, this is much better, yes, make a colony here. Coincidentally, Port Jackson didn't stay the name, it later became known as Sydney Harbour, which you probably now know for like the Opera House, Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Olympics, all that sort of stuff. Although the Olympics are about 20 years ago now, which just seems a long time ago. Before I was even born, wow! Anyway, so what happened was, when they arrived, they set up the colony, and Arthur Phillip, the governor Arthur Phillip, was given the task of building relations with people in New Holland. Now, the people in New Holland, or called Aborigines, and they had, their lives couldn't be much more different than the lives of the British. They had quite a simple life, if you will. They were nomadic, they were hunter-gatherers, really. They were, and on the other hand, the British were a highly industrialised Western society. So trying to bridge that gap was absolutely impossible. But Arthur Phillip had a trick up his sleeve. This was to kidnap an Aborigine and keep him at the government office. Now, you're probably sitting at home thinking that's a really bad idea. And when I first heard that idea, I thought that's such a bad idea. But considering what a bad idea it is, it actually worked quite well. I mean, it didn't really work really well. It only worked really well considering what a bad idea it was. They actually became fairly good friends, and when it was a chap called Arabanu, by the way, they kidnapped, he stayed at the government office for 6 months and went back to his tribe. So what happened is Arthur Phillip was quite sad, so he kidnapped 2 more to make up for his loss of him going home. Most famous, a chap called Benelong, who afterwards he became great friends. He learned a bit of English, called Arthur Philip's father. He ended up living at a place called Benelong Point, which is named after him, and now where the Sydney Opera House stands. So they actually made quite good friends. And when they had the smallpox epidemic of 1789, the physician took quite a few Aboriginal children in to treat. So first off, things are going really great. I mean, like half the convicts are like starving to death because they don't have enough food. But apart from that, things are going really great. Then things go a bit wrong. In 1789, we mentioned the smallpox epidemic that wiped out 7% of the Aboriginal population. Things are not going so great anymore all of a sudden. Now, people say that the British gave the Aborigines smallpox. I don't want to sound as though I'm all like pro-imperialism here, but I don't think the British did give them smallpox. There was a smallpox epidemic going through Indonesia at the time, and I think it just happened to get to Australia at around about the similar time the British were there. So I don't think the British are to blame for everything. This next thing, though, is what the British are to blame for. This next thing was definitely the British fault. It's called the Frontiers Wars. They had a war with them over territory and hunting, because the British copied the Aboriginal hunting, but on a completely unsustainable level. So instead of killing one kangaroo, they'd kill 100 kangaroos for dinner. Because you have to remember that the British didn't actually bring any farmers with them, and they didn't actually get many supplies. So the British, they didn't think things through very well. So anyway, 70% of the Aborigines were killed in the smallpox epidemic. 40,000 were killed in the Frontiers Wars. That lasted 12 years. A chap called Pemulwuy, that was the man who was in charge of the Aborigines. Anyway, so things were going really well, but then they sort of went downhill. But then things started picking up again. For the colony, that is, the Aborigines, things didn't get any better for the Aborigines. For the British, things started to really pick up, because by this point, people were coming to the end of their sentences. But more and more were deciding not to go back to Britain, because Britain was a very judgmental place, where they weren't accepted back in society. But Australia was a place where they can start a new life, and it would be redemption, if you will. For instance, a chap called George Cribb started a very successful butcher business, and he even sent a letter to his nephew telling him to commit a crime, be transported to Australia, and start a new life there. There was a couple of millionaires. One of them became editor of the Tasmanian Herald. Not the Tasmanian Herald, that's a completely made-up newspaper. Tasmanian Mercury. A chap called, who I can't actually remember his name, come to think of it, but I'm sure you can look it up if you really want to. He became the world's first, he was transported for forgery, and he became a very prolific architect, and he became the world's first forger to appear on a banknote in the 1960s in Australia. So things actually got off to a bit of a good start. Now, this is quite unprecedented, because first colonies don't normally go well. I mean, just have to look at the history of America and about all the first colonies that failed. I mean, the Jamestown didn't really kick off particularly well. I mean, Roanoke, oh my god, Roanoke, they just disappeared. Nobody knows where they went. Poof! I mean, there was way more people went to Australia. There was like 200 people went to Roanoke, and like over 1,000 went to Australia in the first fleet. There were more fleets afterwards. But that's basically the start of the history of Australia as we know it. Of course, we all know, because we're very good historians, that Australian history starts several 100,000 years beforehand, because the Aborigines were the world's longest ongoing civilization. Unfortunately, they didn't really particularly thrive alongside the colonists, which was very sad. But things like that will not happen again, because we are all good historians, as I mentioned earlier, and we know how to treat people nowadays. We are now good anthropologists, because James Cook, by the way, who I mentioned earlier, was like the world's worst anthropologist. This is completely aside to it, but when he went to Tahiti, he knocked down a religious temple and he didn't realise it, and they said, "Hey, what did you do that for?" And he's, "I'm sorry I knocked down your religious temple. Would you like 2 hatchets in return?" He's like the world's worst anthropologist. But he was a good navigator, so I don't know if we can let him off. Maybe we can. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to Time Travel TV, and cheerio!